Alright, real quick. Now I've decided to do a retrospective of sorts. Since Rise 2, Maximus Rise of the Grunts 2, releases on August 3rd, at least that's the release date I'm trying to hit, I've decided to do a sort of commentary video like I did with M2 PvP and the BM2 villains. I've decided to do a commentary video about Rise of the Grunts 1 as a whole, because Rise of the Grunts 1 is a train wreck in every single way. And I want to talk about it because it's funny. And I'm going to talk about what things Rise 2 improved on. And there's even a few things Rise 1 did better than Rise 2, but whatever. Alright, first we're going to talk about the playables. Not only because that's where the game starts, you know, with the character select screen and all, but the playables kind of define how Rise 1 is in my mind. If the playables in Rise 1 weren't designed the way they are, then I probably wouldn't look back on the game as fondly as I do. They're a key part as to why the game is so unique. And here's the thing about the Rise 1 playables. They are not designed well in the slightest. Alright, so I'm going to start with Wolfius first, as I think it's the closest thing I got to getting a playable right in Rise 1. Also, he's the first character you can pick. Now, Wolfius' basic is fine, whatever. His spin's fine. I think it's a good move, but it's not a big deal or anything. We need to talk about his jab move. That skill, number one, not unique in the slightest. It looks very similar to his basic. In fact, it was originally intended to be his basic, but at some point I made it his first skill. The issue with it is that it's broken. It's essentially, what I essentially did is gave Wolfius the equivalent of Ghostface's basic. Ghostface being the slow DPS character of the base roster. Now, obviously I didn't give Wolfius Ghostface's basic. Ghostface didn't exist. Nor did I give Ghostface Wolfius' first skill. But, on a function level, they're very similar. Wolfius being the fastest base game character, and character in the whole game, now that I think about it, has pretty fast skill windups overall, meaning you can spam the crap out of it. Essentially, giving him a skill that he can just spam and knock back every non-boss enemy. Every enemy that can be knocked back by anything gets knocked back by that move. Yeah, so that move's busted. In Rise 2, sure, the move is way less effective, but number one, it's more unique, and number two, it doesn't break the game. I still think Wolfius is the best character in Rise 2, just because, fast. But it's not broken. Wolfius is, Rise 1's biggest issue with playables, I'm talking about this before I move on to the next character. Rise 1's biggest issue with playables is they're not created equally, which, that's a good and bad thing. Number one, huge diversity compared to any other Maximus or Blackmore game, and even Rise 2. But the issue is that they're not created equally, which means, they're not some characters aren't as good as others. I feel like it's pretty obvious what the issue there is. Yeah. So now we move on to Zamba, the second playable. And Zamba's the most interesting character in the game, in the sense that he went through the most changes. There were several different iterations of Zamba that existed. And honestly, he's probably my least favorite character out of the base game roster. I don't think he's the least viable, but he's easily my least favorite. Now, Zamba in the early builds, the very first beta build, had this thing where he could stun lock enemies. You see, the Stage 2 enemies, not the Stage 1 enemies, that was not a thing for them, because, they went down so quickly, I didn't think it was necessary. But the Stage 2 enemies had this thing where when you hit them, they would have a stagger frame, not like being on the ground or anything like that, where they would just jolt still for a second, couldn't attack or anything. And that meant that if you had a character with a good basic, they could be stun locked. Zamba had the best basic at that time, as Monty didn't exist. And even if he did, Monty's basic is so slow, recharge-wise, that enemies would probably be able to hit him, while you wait for it to recharge. So he couldn't stun lock enemies, but Zamba could. I'm saying probably because the whole hit frame thing was removed before Monty was added, which means that, that didn't exist. Stun locking just didn't exist by the time Monty was added. So Zamba couldn't do that anymore very shortly after. Then there was the head roll move, which that one had no changes whatsoever throughout development because it was fine. And then you had the block. Now, the block was both broken and useless at the same time. You see, it could block every single projectile, and he would take half damage from melee enemies. Most melee enemies. Some wouldn't do that with. Now, I wouldn't call this move crazy useful or anything early on in development. And I thought that it was a significant downgrade from Wolfius's K-button skill, and Monty's K-button skill was broken once he got added. So I decided to buff Zamba's K-button skill by giving him the ability to heal while he's blocking. Very slowly, mind you. And that just kind of made the whole broken sometimes, useless other times thing apply to him even more. That's kind of the whole deal with Zamba. He was worthless, except he was also broken sometimes. That's how Zamba worked. And then later on in the final major update of the game, I decided that, you know what, I'm going to give Zamba a 3-hit combo for his basic, just because. And then I did that. Zamba is the only character in Rise 1 to have a 3-hit combo, a thing that every character in Rise 2 has. It did not help whatsoever. Alright, well, now it's time to talk about Monty, I guess. And briefly, I'm also going to talk about Pawn here. I'll get back to him once his time actually comes. Now, Pawn and Monty have a very similar, yet also very different issue. You see, neither of them really work in the Rise 1 formula. Pawn, the world just kind of takes Pawn and breaks his spine over its knee. You see, Monty will then take the world and break its spine over his knee. Monty's broken, Pawn is useless. That's essentially how they boil down. Or what they boil down to. I guess it's actually time to talk about Monty himself. His basic does 18 damage and staggers every regular enemy. Yeah, sure, he's the second slowest character and all, and unlike Ghostface, he doesn't have any mobility moves, but he has the most health at 150. He has a projectile attack, which, which friggin', knocks back every regular enemy and stuns some of the bosses, that being Damien and Regulus. So yeah, that's cool. And then his slam, which might be the best AoE in the entire game, and most characters have some sort of thing similar to an AoE, so that says a lot. Yeah, Monty's kind of broken. Now in Rise 2, here's the fun thing. Monty in Rise 2 is the character who changed the least compared to Rise 1. I know that's not saying a lot, considering, the only other character in the base game roster is Wolfius. The only other character in the base game roster from Rise 1 is Wolfius, but yeah. Monty is kind of crap in Rise 2. He's my second least favorite character, and he might be the least viable. Now, his super is interesting. I don't know if he'll be the worst now that he has the super that he does. I don't think it's the best super in the game or anything, but I just know that Lasser's super is a combo-based super. So, yeah. That's neat, I guess. Alright, next would be Ghostface. Now, Ghostface is interesting in the sense that she's the first OC character in the game. I'll get back to the whole community involvement thing later. I'm just mentioning it now. Now, her moveset's pretty interesting as well. Her basic attack's pretty good. Probably the best one out of all of the base game characters. It's either hers or Monty. Monty's does way more damage, but hers, knocks back enemies. His only staggers, so yeah. Now, her moves are also interesting. The whole slide thing, yeah, that exists. I think she was the first character to have something like that in the base game, and then 2 out of the 3 DLC characters had one. So that's neat, I guess. Now, the whole snowman thing. I remember suggesting the whole snowman AoE concept thing. I didn't even suggest the snowman part, just an AoE freeze thing. Just because I didn't want to do whatever Ghostface's other move is. I thought it would be too difficult. So I suggested doing a freeze AoE thing, and then I added a single status effect to the game. I didn't want to make a particular move because I was lazy. So I put way more effort into the game, making an entire status effect and dedicating it to one move. God, I'm a genius, but whatever. Also, uniqueness. The other move was far less unique than, the freeze AoE thing, but still. Now, this isn't like unprecedented to have a move always do a status effect. In M1, which is what this is actually based off of, Julius's super, once you leveled it up, could freeze enemies and make that exact same snowman thing. And, eventually it would level up to be a rock thing. They would be frozen in rock for some reason. I think that's what it was at max. I don't remember. But whatever. And also now in M2, there are talents that have a 100% chance to, do an elemental thing like Shishima's Dark Claw. So it's not unheard of for characters to have that, but, like, it's still weird. It's still very, very weird. The biggest issue with Ghostface probably is her lack of speed. She is the slowest character in the game, slower than Monty. Now, obviously, the slide helps make up for that. I didn't want to make her faster than Monty and also have the slide. So there's kind of a trade-off there. She does have less health than Monty, but out of the base game characters, which is all I'm talking about in this video, Ghostface has the second most health. So overall, I think she's one of the better characters in the base game, but just not broken. I think she's the best not broken character in the base game. And now, finally, we move on to Pawn. I'm not talking about the DLC characters or DLC content in this video unless it's a retroactive change like Zamba's combo thing. All that stuff could become its own video, as the DLC content is very interesting. So I'll probably talk about that in a separate video someday. Now, Pawn is easily the worst character in the game from a practical standpoint, DLC included, as he has the lowest health. Sure, he is the second fastest character, but again, lowest health, 50 health, which is like nothing. He also has a ranged basic, but it can only aim left and right for obvious reasons. His secondary skill is also a ranged move, and sure, it pierces and knocks back enemies, but it still doesn't do a crazy amount of damage. And his primary skill is just a worse version of Wolfius's jab skill. So yeah, Pawn is terrible. Now here's my final conclusion about the playable characters. Pawn may be terrible, but he's unique. And that kind of applies to everyone in Rise 1. A lot of characters in Rise 1 aren't very practical. I don't think Ghostface is a very practical character. I don't think Monty is a very practical character, even though you can cheese the hell out of the game with him. I don't think Pawn is a very practical character. The thing about them is that they all have interesting things going on, though. If you were to take those guys and actually try to balance them and put them in a game that worked, they'd be far less fun. Take Monty, for example. Putting him in Rise 2 and just kind of filtering him through to actually make him work and not be broken. Sure, he works in Rise 2, and he's on the same bell curve as the other playables. I don't think there's a playable in Rise 2 that is terrible. Sure, there definitely are in Rise 1, but I don't think there's a playable in Rise 2 that is god-awful or anything. They're all, at the very least, usable. Some more so than others, but they're all at the very least usable. Maximus 2 is the same way, the actual Maximus 2. Sure, some characters are far better than others. Lerat is way better than Bishop, but you can still get through story mode relatively, easily as Bishop. That's not really too big of a deal. If you tried to get through story mode as Pawn in Rise 1, you would not have fun, like at all. And that's the deal with Rise 1. If you try and actually balance it, all of that just kind of falls through, The game is as charming as it is because a lot of it just isn't designed well. But in a weird way, it kind of works to make this weird creature that's nothing like either of the actual Maximus games. And that's kind of the bad thing about Rise 2. Rise 2 is, I don't think it's a great game or anything. It might not even be a good game, but it's at least, competent. It is a competent game with rules that I tried to follow. And yeah, there were rules in Rise 1, but I designed an entire status effect for one character because I didn't want to implement a combo. And then I went on to implement a combo anyway. That's essentially what we're dealing with here. Rise 1 is a chaotic beast. And that's the only reason I look back on it fondly. If it was consistent in the slightest, then it would just be a poorly programmed Maximus 1 clone. But it's not. It's not designed well. It's not coded well. It is such a weird creature. And in a weird way, I like it more than Rise 2, even if Rise 2 is a far better video game. Alright, so now it's time to talk about the community involvement in Rise of the Grunts 1. And I think this is a big part of it. You see, the community had a lot of involvement in Rise 1. If you suggested a thing to me at the time and I thought it was reasonable, which I thought most of it was reasonable, I'd probably add it to the game. Characters like Zamba, the Zombigales from Stage 3, an entire mini-boss being Regulus were added to the game just because someone was like, hey, you should do that. And I was like, okay. Now, that did have some issues, like Endless was suggested. And Endless is probably the worst thing that was ever added to the game, but we'll get back to that in the inevitable DLC video. Here's the funny thing. There were a few suggestions that I completely ignored or said no to. Some of them being just completely outrageous, like I was asked to add Rat King to Blackmore 1. How do I do that? How do I make an official update? I'm not even going to question it. And then the other one's pretty funny. You see, Quack, one of the developers of the game series that, Rise 1 is based off of, suggested that I added Huggins to the game. And I was like, I do not wish to do that. So I didn't do that. Yeah, I didn't want to add a grab-based character to the game because I didn't really want to know how to program grabs. Didn't want to put the effort in to learn how to do it. Didn't want a character with grabs in the game at all. And then eventually I did that for Rise 2 because I really, really like contradicting things that I've said in the past. But whatever. Yeah. The community had a lot of involvement in Rise 2. Now, Rise 1. CK was obviously the primary playtester. He even did a few tracks in the game. And DGM did and by most I mean all of the secondary artwork of the game. Anything that wasn't used in actual gameplay and stuff on the map screen was drawn by him. Everything in the actual gameplay was drawn by me. But the title screen, the character select screen, you can tell what was drawn by him and what was drawn by me. You can tell. I don't even need to point this out. Anyway, and he also suggested the first OC character in the game, that being Ghostface. Now, I do want to clarify, Ghostface was added before he agreed to do any of the artwork for the game or anything like that. That wasn't some sort of payment that I'd add his OC if he did all that. No, the OC was added before any of that was. I'm going to make that clear, but whatever. I should also talk about the endings and stuff like that. The endings, I guess I'll talk about story in general here. Now, the story in Rise 1 is weird, but it works. It's cohesive, whatever. The Black Book ties into it really well. Almost every enemy entry in the Black Book ties into the actual plot of the game, and I think that's cool. The Black Book might actually be my favorite thing in Rise 1. It's consistent to the lore for the most part, and I think that's cool. It's consistent to itself. I think it's better than the actual Black Book from the main series, for what's that's worth. I think the Black Book in the main series is kind of poo-poo. But yeah, I think that's the one thing Rise 1 does better than the main series. Also, mounts. I guess I can talk about mounts for a second. There's one of them in the base game. You see, the whole mount attack thing being mapped to a second button and not restricting the character's movement at all. Yeah, they're better than M2 mounts. And back when Rise 1 was in development, you couldn't actually dismount M2 mounts. So that's cool. But whatever. Yep. So let's talk about the enemies and stages of Rise 1. Each stage in Rise 1 is supposed to be based off of a stage from a main series game. So the Grove is based off of, the Blackmore 2 level. Pit of Bones is based off the M1 level. The City of the Damned is based off of Raven's background from BM1 for some reason. The Fake Crypt is supposed to be Dungeon Time related, and the boss of that was originally supposed to be from Dungeon Time, Magnus, and I later replaced him in development with Forrest. And I think that was a good decision. And then the Delta is supposed to be a mashup of the previous 4 levels because, it uses their bosses, and I think that works. The enemies themselves, I like their designs. I'm not a huge fan of their artwork and animations, but I'm not going to get into the artwork in Rise 1. It was the best that I could do at the time, so I don't hold it against me or anything like that. I don't hold it against myself, I'll say that. But yeah, I like the designs themselves. I prefer a lot of the enemy designs in Rise 1 to Rise 2. They're far more colorful. They're not that detailed or anything, but again, they're vibrant, they're fun to look at, whatever. And the ones that returned from Rise 1 and came back in Rise 2 are definitely the standouts of Rise 2. Zombigale, I think, is the best enemy in Stage 2. Zavuki's the coolest enemy in Stage 1, etc. Except for Skiz. I like Skiz. I think he's a pretty cool one, but whatever. Out of the new enemies, Skiz is probably my favorite in Rise 2, but let's stay focused on Rise 1. Let's talk about bosses now. The boss roster in Rise 1, as crap as it is from a gameplay standpoint, is very, very weird and interesting. There's literally just a dude who has a spike for a head. You have methed out Scar. Yes, he was supposed to be on meth. Not canonically, of course, but that was literally the thing that I described him as when he was revealed. The invisible guy from BM1's no longer invisible for some reason. And then you just have random Wendigo accompanied by random enemy from Maximus 1. That was just what the 4th stage boss was. And then you have Schlurgle, who is literally the final boss of Rise of the Grunts 1, is literally named after a shield in BM2. That shield being named after a boss in Toon Shooters 2. That's what we're dealing with here. So yeah, I really, really like how weird Rise 1 is, but it's cohesive in itself, barring the DLCs. Again, we'll get to that in a separate video. So it's time for the conclusion bit. I know this video's been messy overall, and I've put more focus into some things than others, because, number one, because this is a Rise 1 video, it should be messy. And number two, I put focus in the things I thought were most important, that being the characters and playables themselves. Now here's the fun thing. I like Rise 1 a lot more than Rise 2. I love Rise 1 more than Rise 2. I know it's kind of weird to pick your children like that, but I like Rise 1 more than Rise 2. Now here's the thing, that also applies to Maximus 1 and Maximus 2. Kind of. I love Maximus 2 more than Maximus 1, but if I'm not playing either of the games and I'm just watching videos of them, I would much rather watch a video of Maximus 1. Aesthetically, I just think that's far more fun to look at than Maximus 2, even if Maximus 2 is higher quality and all that. I just prefer looking at Maximus 1. Same thing with Rise of the Grunts. As long as I don't have to touch it and risk getting infected, I like Rise of the Grunts 1 more than Rise of the Grunts 2. I love it a lot more than that second game, even if the second game is better from a gameplay standpoint. And I know that's a whole bias thing. If you were an outsider, there would be literally no reason to prefer Rise 1, unironically, to Rise 2. That story stuff does not matter. Would not matter to an outsider because, you know, they know nothing about FF lore or anything like that. None of that would matter. None of the stuff in base game Rise 1 would matter. Restoration's weird. I'll get to that in the whole DLC video. But nothing in base game Rise 1 is better than in Rise 2 from an unironic perspective. Yet I can't help but prefer Rise 1. Or at least the idea of Rise 1. So yeah, I feel like translating stuff from Rise 1 to Rise 2, sure, I like the way some of it looks more in Rise 2, Zombigale being an example, but some of it, like Damien, and Damien just looks worse in Rise 2. Skullgrin just looks worse in Rise 2. I just prefer the way they look in the first game more. Upgrading the graphics didn't really help at all. I just prefer the weird charm of Rise 1 to almost anything in Rise 2. Even though Rise 2 is just a far better game in almost every way. Not even almost every way. It is a better game in every way as a game. But, yeah.